The relationship between the United States and Iran has entered what many analysts are calling its most dangerous phase in decades. We're watching a moment where decades of accumulated tensions, broken agreements, and strategic miscalculations are converging into something potentially catastrophic. Iran's recent statements about mobilizing Islamic solidarity against potential American military action aren't simply rhetoric or empty threats. They represent a fundamental shift in how regional powers are positioning themselves in an increasingly multipolar world order. What we're witnessing is the consequence of long-term policy failures on both sides, but particularly the collapse of diplomatic frameworks that once provided at least minimal pathways for de-escalation. The economic sanctions regime, the assassination of General Soleimani, the abandonment of the nuclear agreement, these weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a broader strategy that assumed American military and economic dominance could dictate outcomes indefinitely. But that assumption is now colliding with a different reality. Iran has spent years building alternative economic relationships, strengthening regional alliances, and developing asymmetric capabilities, precisely because it understood that conventional military confrontation with the United States would be suicidal. The language of holy war, of Islamic mobilization, isn't just religious fervor. It's a calculated geopolitical strategy designed to raise the costs of American intervention to unbearable levels. We need to understand something fundamental about what's happening here, and it requires us to step back from the immediate headlines and look at the structural forces that have brought us to this moment. When Iranian officials talk about mobilizing the Islamic world against American aggression, they're not speaking from a position of strength in the traditional sense. They're speaking from a position of calculated desperation, which in many ways is far more dangerous. This is a country that has been under some form of economic warfare for over 4 decades, a nation that has watched its currency collapse, its people suffer under sanctions, and its regional influence constantly challenged by the world's most powerful military machine. But here's what the mainstream analysis consistently misses. Iran has also spent those 4 decades learning, adapting, and building a network of relationships and capabilities specifically designed to make American military intervention so costly that it becomes politically impossible. Let's talk about what economic sanctions actually mean in human terms, because this context is essential for understanding why Iran's rhetoric has become so militant. When we impose sanctions, we're not just limiting a government's ability to buy weapons or fund military programs. We're talking about ordinary families who can't get medicine, about a middle class that has watched its savings evaporated by inflation, about young people who see no future in their own country because the international banking system has been weaponized against them. The Iranian economy has been strangled systematically, and this creates a population that has less and less to lose. This isn't about justifying any particular government's actions. It's about understanding the material conditions that shape political possibilities. A country with nothing to lose makes very different calculations than a country with prosperity to protect. Now, when Trump was previously in office, we saw a very specific approach to Iran that broke with decades of diplomatic precedent. The withdrawal from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the nuclear deal that had been painstakingly negotiated, wasn't just a policy shift. It was a signal that the United States no longer considered itself bound by international agreements when they became inconvenient. Think about what that communicates to Tehran. You negotiate in good faith, you accept international inspectors, you limit your nuclear program, and then a new administration simply tears up the agreement and imposes even harsher sanctions. The lesson Iran learned wasn't that cooperation leads to normalization. The lesson was that cooperation leads to vulnerability without reward. This is why the current rhetoric from Iran sounds so absolute, so uncompromising. They've tried the diplomatic route, and from their perspective, it led nowhere except to more economic pain. But there's a larger strategic picture here that goes beyond the bilateral relationship between Washington and Tehran. Iran has been positioning itself as a key node in what some analysts call the axis of resistance, a loose coalition of state and non-state actors across the Middle East who oppose American hegemony in the region. This includes Hezbollah in Lebanon, various militias in Iraq and Syria, the Houthi movement in Yemen, and of course, Hamas in Gaza. When Iranian officials threaten to mobilize Islamic solidarity, they're not talking about some abstract religious war. They're talking about activating a network of proxy forces that could open multiple fronts simultaneously, making any American military action against Iran exponentially more complex and costly. This is asymmetric warfare strategy at the geopolitical level. The economic dimension of this can't be overstated. Iran has spent years working to circumvent American sanctions by building alternative trade relationships, particularly with China and Russia. These aren't just economic partnerships. They're part of a broader realignment of global power that challenges the dollar-dominated system that has been the foundation of American influence since World War II. When Iran sells oil to China in yuan, when it conducts trade with Russia outside the SWIFT banking system, it's participating in the gradual erosion of the mechanisms through which the United States has exercised global economic control. This is why the stakes are so much higher than just one regional conflict. We're watching the architecture of the post-war international order being contested in real time. Let's consider what a conflict would actually look like, because the scenarios are far more complex than the simplified narratives we get in most media coverage. Iran doesn't need to defeat the United States military in conventional terms. That would be impossible, and they know it. What they need to do is make the cost of war so high that the American public loses its appetite for another prolonged Middle Eastern conflict. They do this through several mechanisms. First, there's the threat to global oil supplies. The Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly 20% of the world's oil passes, could be disrupted or even temporarily closed. The economic shockwaves from that alone would be catastrophic, sending oil prices soaring and potentially triggering a global recession. Second, there are the proxy forces throughout the region who could attack American bases, American personnel, and American allies simultaneously. We saw a preview of this capability when Iranian-backed militias struck American positions in Iraq and Syria. Multiply that across the entire region, and you have a nightmare scenario for military planners. Then there's the domestic political dimension within the United States itself. The American public is exhausted from 2 decades of wars in Iraq and Afghanistan that achieved virtually none of their stated objectives while costing trillions of dollars and thousands of lives. The idea of launching another major military campaign in the Middle East, especially one that could drag on for years with no clear exit strategy, faces enormous political resistance. Iran's strategy is partly based on this calculation, that American democracy, for all its flaws, still requires some level of public consent for war, and that consent is increasingly difficult to manufacture. This is why the rhetoric about Islamic mobilization is aimed not just at rallying regional support, but at signaling to the American public just how messy and protracted a conflict would become. We also need to examine the role of Israel in this equation, because it's impossible to understand the current tensions without recognizing how intertwined Israeli and American policy toward Iran have become. The Netanyahu government has been pushing for military action against Iran's nuclear program for years, viewing an Iranian bomb as an existential threat to the Israeli state. This has created a situation where American policy is heavily influenced by Israeli security concerns, sometimes to the point where it's difficult to tell where one ends and the other begins. The problem is that Israel's interests and America's interests, while overlapping, are not identical. What makes strategic sense from Tel Aviv's perspective doesn't necessarily make sense from Washington's perspective, especially when you factor in the global economic implications and the risk of a wider regional war. The nuclear question itself deserves careful analysis because it's been so distorted by political rhetoric. Iran has consistently maintained that its nuclear program is for peaceful energy purposes, though very few observers believe this entirely. The more relevant question is, why wouldn't Iran want nuclear weapons given its strategic environment? It's surrounded by hostile powers, has been threatened with regime change repeatedly, and has watched other countries receive very different treatment based on their nuclear status. North Korea, for instance, developed nuclear weapons and suddenly became untouchable in terms of military intervention. Libya gave up its weapons program and its leader ended up dead in a ditch. These aren't abstract lessons, they're concrete examples that inform how states think about their security. From Tehran's perspective, a nuclear deterrent isn't aggressive expansionism. It's basic survival logic in an international system where might often determines outcomes. The religious dimension of Iran's threatened response also requires nuanced understanding. When Iranian leaders invoke Islamic solidarity and speak about holy war, Western audiences often hear this as irrational fanaticism, but it's actually a very calculated appeal to specific constituencies across the Muslim world. Iran is a Shia Muslim power in a predominantly Sunni region, which has historically limited its influence. But by framing potential American aggression as an attack on Islam itself rather than just on Iran, Tehran is attempting to bridge that sectarian divide and mobilize broader support. Whether this strategy would actually work is debatable. Saudi Arabia and other Sunni powers have their own deep conflicts with Iran, but the attempt itself reveals sophisticated thinking about how to leverage religious identity for geopolitical purposes. There's also the question of what Trump's return to power would actually mean for this situation. During his first term, Trump pursued what he called maximum pressure, which combined harsh sanctions with occasional military strikes and the threat of overwhelming force. This approach succeeded in devastating Iran's economy, but completely failed to change its behavior or bring it back to negotiations on American terms. If anything, it strengthened the hand of hardliners in Tehran, who had always argued that the United States could not be trusted. A second Trump administration would likely resume this strategy, possibly with even more aggressive military action, given that the previous approach didn't achieve its objectives. But here's the fundamental problem. There's no evidence that more of the same will produce different results. If 4 years of maximum pressure didn't force Iranian capitulation, why would another 4 years work? We should also consider the human cost of these escalating tensions, because behind all the strategic calculations are real people whose lives are being destroyed. The Iranian people have suffered enormously under sanctions, with medicine shortages, economic collapse, and increasing isolation from the global community. Young Iranians, many of whom are highly educated and have no particular loyalty to the current regime, find themselves trapped in a country with few opportunities and a future that looks increasingly bleak. At the same time, American service members would be the ones sent to fight if conflict breaks out, and they'd be risking their lives in another war that most Americans don't understand and didn't ask for. The Yemeni people, caught in a proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran, have experienced one of the world's worst humanitarian catastrophes. The Syrian people have seen their country destroyed, partly because of Iranian intervention supporting Assad. The list goes on. These aren't abstractions. They're millions of individual human beings whose lives are shaped by decisions made in capitals far from where they live. The broader shift toward multipolarity in the international system makes this situation even more volatile. For decades after the Cold War, the United States operated in what was effectively a unipolar world, where American power was unmatched and unchallenged. That era is ending. China has emerged as a genuine economic and increasingly military rival. Russia, despite its economic weakness, has reasserted itself as a spoiler power, willing to challenge American initiatives. Regional powers like Iran, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia are pursuing their own agendas with less deference to Washington's preferences. This means that conflicts that might once have been contained through American dominance now have the potential to spiral in unpredictable ways as multiple powers pursue competing interests. An American strike on Iran could trigger Chinese or Russian responses, either directly or through their own proxy networks, creating escalation dynamics that no single actor can fully control. The economic warfare dimension deserves even more attention because it represents a fundamental transformation in how power is exercised in the 21st century. Traditional war involves armies, tanks, and bombs. Economic warfare involves sanctions, banking restrictions, and trade embargoes. The latter can be just as devastating as the former in terms of human suffering, but it operates below the threshold that typically triggers international outcry or domestic political resistance. When we sanction a country's central bank, freeze its assets, and prevent it from participating in global trade, we're engaging in an act of economic siege warfare. The effects are cumulative and long-term, slowly strangling an entire economy and society. Iran has been living under this siege for decades, and it shapes every aspect of how the country operates and how its leaders think about their options. What we're ultimately witnessing is the collision of two incompatible strategic visions with no clear mechanism for resolution. The United States wants a Middle East where Iranian influence is contained, where Israel's security is guaranteed, and where American interests in oil and regional stability are protected. Iran wants to be recognized as a legitimate regional power with the right to pursue its own security interests and ideology without constant threat of military intervention or economic strangulation. These visions cannot both be realized simultaneously, which is why the situation keeps cycling through periods of tension and near conflict without ever finding stable equilibrium. Neither side can achieve a decisive victory without unacceptable costs, but neither side is willing to make the compromises that would be necessary for genuine coexistence. The rhetoric of holy war and Islamic mobilization that we're hearing from Tehran isn't primarily about religion. It's about raising the perceived costs of American action to the point where even the most hawkish voices in Washington might pause. It's a deterrent strategy wrapped in religious language. Whether it will work depends largely on how seriously American policymakers take the threat and whether they believe Iran has the capability and will to follow through. The danger is that both sides might miscalculate, that decision-makers in Washington might believe Iran is bluffing while decision-makers in Tehran might believe that strong rhetoric alone will prevent attack. These kinds of mutual miscalculations are exactly how wars start that neither side really wanted.